There are so many problems with the world, with the legal profession. We'll talk about some. But I'm encouraged by the fact that this kind of event highlights the possibilities, the foundation we have to build on, the incredible things that are going on, the good ideas that we can seize. And I'm just thrilled and honored and humbled to be a part of that. Last but not least, I do have to thank my daughter, Ria, who's turning 11 today and is having a birthday party about 3 miles away from here. She gave me a hall pass to be absent for about an hour and a half. And she looked straight into my eyes just as I left. She said, "Dude," and you know it's bad when your daughter calls you dude, right? "You better be back here in an hour and a half." So I'm grateful to Ria. So this building is an interesting building because it used to be a dorm. And right here is where John Steinbeck lived and where Herbert Hoover lived. A couple floors up is pretty much the space where Herbert Hoover occupied when he was a student from kind of an out-of-the-way place. He came to what was then a pretty new university. It was full of excitement. And it was fairly often when I would be walking around this building where I spent a lot of time before going onto the court, when I'd ask myself, what would Herbert Hoover think? I mean, simply because he used to live here, about the world if he were back here, if he were looking around. He was a smart man. He was ambitious. He was at core an engineer, like many people who come to Stanford and run Silicon Valley. But there were two things that were very important in his life that I think are key to any effort to understanding the legal profession. And these are just some thoughts that I want to brainstorm with you about because you have your own ideas and I want to hear them. His life was marked by an engagement with industry and business and technology. What was then technology? He worried about mining, how you got minerals out of the earth. But also globalization. This was the man who basically thought through how the US would engage with the incredible human misery following World War I, and then again actually in World War II, and played a key role in delivering relief. So he thought about train schedules, he thought about not punch cards exactly, but about timetables, about how you could take mathematical formulas to figure out how to organize people and materials. And I got to say, I think it's interesting then to juxtapose that with 21st century law practice because it will not surprise you that I'm one of many, many people who think that we are in the midst of a moment of incredible opportunity, but also dislocation as we try to marry up, in a way, some traditions that the legal profession is a trustee of, that we are all as lawyers trustees of, a sense of service to your client, a sense of humanity, of due process, of justice, along with powerful forces that no individual controls. Forces that go under different labels, but I'll just use two convenient ones, globalization and technology. Globalization, you pick up the phone and let's not even talk legal service. Let's just talk like you call United Airlines or Hilton Hotels because you want to change something about your travel plans and you're talking to somebody in the Philippines. And they take classes maybe to make it a little harder for you to tell that you're talking to someone from the Philippines, but you can tell sometimes. And then meanwhile, technology, well, I'll just mention one event that happened not in this building, but about 30 meters from where we are across the way at the Hoover Institution. One of the captains of industry from here in Silicon Valley, if they call themselves that, maybe they call themselves something different, but he was just holding court, being interviewed, much the way I am, and talked a little bit about what he expected to see in 6 years. And, I'll stay fairly general, but he said essentially, what I imagine is an app that will learn. You will write some emails, and the app will figure out how you sound. The app will figure out who you want to brush off with a sort of polite email when you really don't feel that, and you want to say that you want to meet with them, but you really don't. And the app will know who you actually want to hang out with and spend time with. Over time, not long, the app will figure out how you will want to write to your wife, perhaps. It'll let you answer questions more quickly, and you'll be able to talk to the app, and you won't even have to much because the app will talk to you and will give you a sense of how you want to spend your day. And then he said, I think that is on the horizon, will be here in about 6 years. And so the audience had an interesting reaction because about half the people in the audience kind of gasped a little bit, and about the other half of the audience started debating whether they thought the prediction was just a little too optimistic or not optimistic enough. The engineers in the room, the computer scientists, they started talking about just what the algorithm would actually have to look like and how long the period of latency would be of the software reading your emails before it could sort of pick up and write for you. And I'll just sort of end this sort of long, slightly rambling introduction by saying what I think is really interesting about these two forces and asking how will they affect our profession is that we have two resources in the world that we generate as lawyers. And one of them, I'm sure, is scarce. I'm not sure if the other one is, but it might well be. And both are likely to be affected by these changes. What is for sure scarce is our time, like how you can slice up the pie that is your day. And this is a two-edged sword when you think about that relative to technology in particular, because it cuts both ways. In some respects, the companies that develop this software will be telling you, because your time is so precious, turn over some decisions, how you write an email to a client, to the software. But it's also true that that very same technology is competing fiercely for your time. Not just the ads, but also the different and new ways of using machines to talk to more people, to do more things, to have more of your work done in a different way, and so on. I am sure that our time is scarce. I'm not sure that our loyalty is scarce, but I will highlight that our profession is, it exists within layers and layers of loyalty relationships to the nation state, to our state, to the legal system, to our clients, to the bar, to the judicial officers we appear before. And this I'm less certain of, but I'll just put it out there for conversation. Amidst all the potential and excitement of all these changes, I sense also a kind of weakening of those bonds of loyalty and think that part of it is driven by a sense of, well, okay, we're in different jurisdictions, we have clients across borders, we have all these demands on our time. I had a student who grew up in Italy. Then his diplomat parents went to Philadelphia for a while to be the Italian consuls there. He then went to Wharton and came to Stanford Law School and then was clerking for a judge in Arizona. And when I asked him the question of where he wanted to live and whether he missed Europe, he said to me 3 times, I just don't understand your question. I will go where the job is. And I have to tell you, I think in some ways that's a terrific thing, but it also raises all those questions.
Well, and so what it sounds to me like you're saying is, in a way, one of the things that technology could do, if we don't watch out, is it could commoditize what we do.
Yes.
And that's something we got to think about.
Yes. And to say just a little more about that, how and how much, I think these are precisely the questions that our president just raised and are at the heart of what I hope that this group will deliberate about. And let me highlight one thing in particular, because if you're in Silicon Valley, it's hard for you not to think that the world is partly driven by what consumers will buy. And there have to be limits on that, but the key is not only what is technology capable of doing, but also what are the people going to be satisfied with. In other words, you could make a really compelling argument that the software, not just 7 years from now, but 14 years from now, despite the incredible feats of communication and analysis it can do, it can't do what a human lawyer can do. But that's only half the question. The other half of the question is the audience for that going to say, well, okay, that delta of difference is something that matters to me, and I want to engage with a human in this way.
Mm-hmm. So with that context, what do you think are the most significant unmet needs that we face?
There's so many. I honestly don't trust myself to answer the question. So instead what I'll tell you is some unmet needs that I see out there, but there are many more. And this is something that you all would have really interesting answers to this question. Sitting here in California, it is hard not to suddenly think about language. Let's just start with that, which is an issue I've been drawn into early in my time in the judiciary. So if you add up all the people in Texas who don't speak English very well, and all the people in Florida who don't speak English very well, that's about the number we have in California. And that number is about 7.5 million. And Spanish comes to mind as one language, but you've got like Tagalog, Vietnamese, Korean, various flavors of Chinese, Central American languages. And these are folks who are often disproportionately interacting with the criminal justice system. So the way we meet their needs is not great, to put it technically. How do we do it? Well, okay, we have hardworking interpreters who show up in criminal cases and in traffic court. How well do we do it on the civil side? Well, historically, California has provided no interpreters in that situation. That is now beginning to change. But you can imagine how whatever else you say about the level of need in that community. If you've got a family law case and you've got two people who don't speak English and they've got a kid that shows up to that proceeding, it is the worst thing, the most heartbreaking thing in the world to see the parents duking it out, stumbling through English, and the kid ending up in a sort of default translator role. But I could go on. Let me just mention two other areas. So in addition to language access, you've got family law itself, where 80% of the litigants here in California are not represented. Then you've got landlord-tenant and housing type stuff, which comes to mind as one example of where you have really asymmetrical dynamics, where 90% of the landlords are represented and about 85 to 90% of the tenants are not. So those come to mind, but even outside the context of legal services for the poor, there are a lot of other unmet needs.
Mm-hmm. What are a couple, just in for say middle class clients?
Well, I think that okay, so here, there are many things about my job I'm learning. One is like how to talk when an issue is like possible for me to talk about, but it does touch on some things that could come before me or come before me. But let's just say, for a lot of people who are in some relationship with large organizations, private sector organizations, and their customers, and they're dealing with some legal problem that arises, perceived or actual, because they don't get what they hoped they would get. That brings up the issue of alternative dispute resolution, which has its own special dynamics, and I'll just stay general about that. But I think the whole question of how do you deal with folks who have not the kind of legal need that can engage a very sophisticated part of our bar in resolving a business need, but are also not at the point where they are meeting a need that is constitutional, or they're facing a need that is constitutionally required to be provided. So the universe of like civil Gideon stuff involving civil confinement, involving civil contempt, involving fairly routine interactions with medium-sized businesses, I think there's a lot more that could be done there.
Right. Okay. So in this meeting here is to try to think about some strategies, some approaches, ways that we can start to attack some of these issues. What are some general things you've thought about as guidelines or principles we could apply?
I do wonder about the role of the courts, especially because of where I'm sitting now, and how, to the extent that state courts have a role to play, and this does vary state by state a little bit, in the rules that govern practice and the relationship to the bar associations, in whether there are some smart, careful, sort of scalpel-oriented ways that you can tweak rules so that maybe folks who are otherwise not licensed to practice in a jurisdiction but have some tie to the jurisdiction, maybe because they're in a law firm headquartered in a place, can do something to help meet the very big chunk of unmet needs that require pro bono. I've watched with interest, but I'm very curious what this audience would say about folks in the finance world, like the hedge fund world, now to go to another extreme, that are getting into funding legal action because they think that there might be some room to bring some kind of consumer action of some kind, but the funding for it really can't come together unless there's a novel funding mechanism. I think that all of us who care both about providing more legal services effectively, but also recognize that technology is not a panacea, have some hard work to do to thread the needle there. I'll just go back to language access to mention one example of how this is playing out in some states and how we have to look at this seriously in California. So if you've got a big state like California and you have some Vietnamese speaker in Shasta County, hundreds and hundreds of miles away from here, that gets picked up because of some theft, there are not a lot of Vietnamese interpreters in Shasta County. There are a whole bunch of them in LA County. So how can we use video to solve that problem and to do it right away? And by the way, there are a lot of reasons to do that. One is because you can get an arraignment done more quickly in Shasta County. But another is because the way we currently deal with interpreters is we fund them in half-day or quarter-day increments. So if we don't solve it the way I just described, you might have to have an interpreter get in a car, drive from LA to Shasta County, do the 10 minutes, and drive back. And I think we can do better.
So you're talking about using technology in that way, the
Correct.
courts using technology to make services more accessible. You're talking about looking at regulation. What about the training of lawyers? You were a law professor for a number of years. Should we change the way we train lawyers?
I think we have some great folks in the room to think that through, but I'll just offer an idea or two. I think lawyers have to learn a lot about technology. The typical lawyer, and about globalization too, and I think law schools are in many ways, including ours here at Stanford, are moving very effectively to take on the globalization piece. There's a really neat class that's being taught that Dean McGill helped get off the ground on basically going global and thinking about how law practice plays out in other parts of the world. And I actually think that's not irrelevant to even the legal services needs too, because you're not just talking about language barriers in some cases, you're talking about different cultural conventions, different ideas about authority. If you're going to be a private sector lawyer doing some high quality pro bono work on issues like refugees and asylum, having some sense of global dynamics is important. But the technology piece is huge. And here I think that there are some skill sets that really take deep knowledge about the law and about technology together, and the number of places where that intersection arises and where you need both kinds of knowledge is growing. Just to mention two examples, if you're trying to figure out this video technology thing and due process, it actually helps to know a little bit about how the internet physically is set up, like the pipes of it, like what makes it likely that you might have a glitch going on, and why it's just not enough to say, oh, well, FaceTime will solve that problem. But even more to the point, as legal services get reorganized and in some cases outsourced, and folks go beyond e-discovery to think about software that can help you automate some legal work, then it's helpful for somebody to understand how an algorithm is put together, like what the weaknesses and blind spots are of software that ultimately is relying on sort of polynomial type analysis, like a kind of mathematical functioning that doesn't quite replicate the human brain. And I think it'd be kind of really neat to ask, how can we make it so that a very large proportion of law school graduates have some pretty basic and comfortable familiarity with it.
They understand what went into the black box in a way.
Exactly, so that not all of them are going to actually be coding, but so they can be, at a minimum, the kind of smart consumers and discerning folks who will push back on code the way I think we've already seen with respect to basic economics, basic statistics. I would argue that psychology is just as important.
Going there.
Got to understand, you're an expert in this, but if we're going to understand machines, we might as well understand people too.
Right.
But, and we have a ways to go there.
Well, to that point, since you brought it up, and I was going to ask you about it anyway, go back to the commoditization fear that you articulated earlier. What about people skills? What about lawyers? One of the things you hear about lawyers from clients is that lawyers are not very good listeners. The lawyers don't communicate a sense of caring about me. That's one of the complaints that you'll get. And as things get more commoditized, you get farther and farther away from that.
I see a problem with some lawyers not being good listeners. I would hesitate to say that it's anything inherent in our profession or in how we train folks. Probably there's a little bit of a selection effect that some folks who make stellar litigators, and not just to point at litigators, but yes, like, okay, well, I think, and judges probably could learn to listen.
Working on that.
I would agree. But so what is one good thing about technology getting to the point where the typical person, maybe 7 years from now, might be in at least a textual interaction with something coming through a machine and not easily be able to tell whether it's a person or not? Well, one good thing is I think that's a competitive pressure that will encourage folks in service-oriented professions to actually be better listeners. Because if we can be, and if part of what lets us be terrific listeners is a mix of empathy and analysis that I would argue is deeply human, then we got to show that.
Okay. So, have you seen anything in any of your various professions that you think is a good example for others to look to, that's a good inspiration?
Yes, in a way, but I'm actually wondering as I think this out loud whether this is actually an encouraging example or not. Because I think about architecture. I think this building is the most beautiful old building at Stanford. That's just my quirky view since I used to work in this building a lot. But another gorgeous building is the building that is currently the heart of Stanford Law School. And if you haven't seen it, you should walk around there. You might have some programs actually there. But it's a beautiful building, and it was not on campus 5 years ago. And the architects that designed it are incredibly thoughtful and perceptive. They're great listeners. They use computers, but also know what computers are not going to do very well. They forced law school faculty, students, and staff to think hard about what goes where. They got something really symbolic and important to this, I would argue, to this gathering, which is if you go to the law school and go to the heart of that new building, which is the courtyard, you are standing on the foundation of the law school, which is the clinic, actually. The clinic is at the very heart of the law school. And the architects understood that it would be something really special, not only to get the academic faculty and the clinic to be in the same building, but to have the clinic be in that foundational place in a way as a reminder that so much of what we do has to be built on a practical understanding of how legal service is delivered. So I say that as an example of how good architects, like the great lawyers who are in this room, can be terrific listeners, innovate, do amazing things, bridge the past and the present. But I also note that architects don't have control of their profession anymore, and most buildings don't actually use architects. So it's, to me, a provocative example of what the tension is when professions try to evolve.
Right. So what value does the lawyer add that a good computer programmer who knows a little law could do?
Empathy,
Yeah.
a sense of how the world truly feels, maybe, to the person that is about to go through a deposition and is freaked out about it. A sense of what the judges might have been thinking as they made the transition from practicing lawyer, or in my case, law professor, to judge, and a sense of how that might affect how they listen exactly. I think that kind of fuzzy reasoning that comes from that is harder to duplicate just throwing raw computing power and math at something. I also feel like there is something about creativity that we haven't yet gotten the hang of how to turn into a computer program.
Well, and again, to go back to what you said at the beginning, there sounds like there's kind of a triage you have to go through in each instance. Is this something that just technology will work with, or is this something that really takes the human touch, or some combination of the two?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And let me just say that for this group and for bar associations and for the state courts that often are in a privity type relationship to bar associations and to supervising professions, it's a really quirky problem, this issue of how much do we actually want to encourage either apps or non-lawyers to take on stuff. Because I think hard about the need to police the boundaries of our profession, but honestly I also think about that 80% of family law litigants that are going out there with no lawyer. And I'm thinking about the landlord-tenant disputes. And so I feel like if we don't have other really great ways of erasing that gap, we have to think about everything in our arsenal to solve the problem.
So last question. We have this great group of people here. We have them here for a day and a half of talking with each other and hearing from some pretty accomplished innovators. What would you like to see them do?
Well, it sounded to me like our president kind of said that by Monday the problem had to be solved. That's what I interpreted, at least. That was my kind of statutory interpretation there. I worry about the two extremes of either thinking that the problems that we have before us are kind of so intractable that nothing will really change, and by the same token kind of feeling like, you know what, we've muddled through this for the last however many 100 years that we've had lawyers, it'll be okay. And I guess I would urge us to look for that uncomfortable middle between the two, a sense of being really deeply ambitious about what we expect to see, but also pretty serious about the economic and technological and social forces that we have to contend with. Maybe one way to strike that balance a little bit, just one thought experiment, is just imagine you were trying to solve this problem for China or India. Now, number one, that should encourage humility, because what do we know about China or India? There are actually a number of people here who know quite a bit, by the way. Maybe I'm just talking about myself. But the point is, every jurisdiction has its own unique problems. But China and India have serious developmental challenges and massive amounts of concentrated poverty in sheer numbers that we don't have in this country anymore. And I think underscore not only the need for humility about how to understand those societies, but the urgency. And then toggling back and thinking about the US presents us with a set of challenges that are less intractable seeming, perhaps. as a way of just thinking that we have a lot at our disposal. Incredible talent is reflected in this room. The fact that notwithstanding all the bad press in the New York Times, a whole bunch of people still want to go to law school. The sense that these new realities that are affecting our profession are also incredible possibilities. They're going to make law practice potentially incredibly exciting. So I want to see that mix of real concern, but also a sense of ambition.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, we have time maybe for a few questions. So we have some mobile mics. Got one over here? Yeah.
Hello. I have no law background. I'm just a techno nerd who won a hackathon for legal access. Thank you.
Good for you.
We would like to help more, but we don't know where the problems lie. We don't know what we need to do. And you guys think these problems are way too big to solve. And if you could just clearly state them, we could probably help you solve them a lot faster.
Thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for being here. And never think of yourself as just a non-lawyer, by the way. At the end of the day, we're going to do well by working with you.
Yeah.
That's what's, in fact, in some ways most exciting. I mean, I would say what the lawyers in this room are all thinking and smiling about is that part of this profession exists because problems that seem easy to state turn out to be hard, right? Just to kind of mention, well, I could mention any number of examples, but I'll just give you one, right? I mentioned family law a couple times because whatever else I can claim credit for having done before becoming a judge, I did not do family law. And
4 years.
That's why I have good friends. But it's an awe-inspiringly immediate thing because like nothing in the world is more important to the folks who are going through a family law dispute when they're going through it. And it's raw, and you'll have judges tell you that they might have handled like gang conspiracy cases, death penalty cases, issues involving like $200 million IP disputes, but nothing was as scary for them as being in a family law courtroom with two people whose marriage is falling apart fighting the way that they sometimes will fight. And so I mention that because like, okay, you then have a court that has the problem of defining what it means for a family to be living separate and apart. And that seems like a simple inquiry, but it can be awfully complicated. But my point is simply that shouldn't stop us from getting a community of folks, including some who are both law and computer trained, but also many who are just law trained and just computer trained, sitting down and thinking through what parts of the inquiry can be sort of triaged into some app that can give very basic knowledge and help folks who are going in and they're not legally represented at all, not represented by lawyers, into those courtrooms to not make some very basic mistakes. That, I mean, I think what we could agree on is that a lot of problems that seem easy are easy, and a number of problems that seem easy are actually incredibly hard.
And I think maybe another thing we could agree on is that people in different professions or in different places in life see the same thing differently.
Exactly.
And that part of what you're saying is a way forward with this dilemma you've been talking about is to get other perspectives, not just the perspective of lawyers.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Another question or two? We have one. Yeah. Here we got it.
So one thing that comes up, and I have been doing family law for about 18 months now, since being admitted to practice. One thing that
That's why you're sitting up front. You knew I was going to say this, right?
we're a couple gunners up here. No, one thing that we come across frequently in our practice is that it seems like a great deal, a great number of the problems that people are dealing with, these especially folks that otherwise would be pro se, but for being able to come in and get our services, is that a lot of the problems that people seem to think are legal problems are not legal problems, and they get so intermeshed and intertwined with other things, economic problems, mental health issues, things like that. To what extent do you think there may be an issue with the perhaps why the problem being so intractable is simply because it's not all a legal problem.
Absolutely. Well, and it doesn't take more than 1 or 2 death penalty cases to make that point in a different way, because you see that, there's a law that needs to be applied, but the way we structure the penalty phase in a proceeding like that, you learn a lot about the perpetrator, and it's not a pretty picture often. All of which is to say that, there are some serious disagreements here, and I'll channel for a moment refugee and asylum issues because I know them well, and I did some cases in this area to kind of show what the disagreements are like. But I think family law is another terrific example of where you see this. It's the role of like the heroic lawyer as thoughtful legal analyst, feisty litigator, and social worker versus the conception of a lawyer as a very technically able person who's in some ways akin more to a computer programmer and is going to be very judicious, and I use the word advisedly, about what the limits of his or her role should be. And that view, which, maybe doesn't get, there's a case to be made for it. And it sounds like this, right? It's like, okay, if you're telling me that huge majorities of people facing life-changing, life-threatening dramas in their lives are not well represented, like, who am I to say that what I really should do is to try to be all things to the limited number of people I can help, rather than to be really thoughtful and to help leverage technology and good organization to carve out the legal problem and do this thing. But again, with the asylum and refugee point, well, what I found to be the case often, dealing in my past life with refugee issues, both at times when the issue has been representing asylum seekers in an advanced industrialized country, but also going to developing countries and dealing with the big mass influx emergencies they have, where there are thousands and thousands of people coming in at once, fleeing conflict, is that it's just awfully, awfully hard to operationalize this idea that you're going to try to take a cotton gin and pull out the legal, because that's not the way people actually experience their lives. And I'll just note that the question I have about that is, I used the word empathy before to talk about what a good lawyer might do with a client in doing the stuff that even a really good computer program 14 years from now might not be able to do. And I think it is about not being quite so scalpel-like with that distinction. And although I have not myself practiced business law in a big law firm, my guess would be that it's kind of not so different for the really sophisticated, incredibly good advisor to captains of industry who's like, you know what, all right, this will solve your legal problem, but you might have a certain set of economic or public relations challenges you'll have to deal with.
Yeah, and I think I was a mental health lawyer, and most of the things my clients wanted were things I couldn't get. They had, some of them were delusional, and the things they wanted me to achieve in court were not things that any court would be able to give. But there were other things I could do for them. I could look and see what was going on with their housing situation or their care situation, and maybe getting some resources into that would improve the situation, and their delusions wouldn't be as painful. So it's the problem identification, the triage, and what are we as lawyers good at? What should we bring in other people or other perspectives to help us do? I think it's a multifaceted view of practice that may have some promise. It's 6 o'clock. It's time to have a party. Would you please join me in thanking Justice Cuéllar?